welcome everybody to Biosafety Now's 11th Twitter space, and I wanted to begin tonight by wishing everyone happy Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a national holiday celebrated in the U.S. that commemorates the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. It's also known as America's second Independence Day. My name is Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University and lab director at the Waxman Institute of Microbiology, and I am one of the co-founders of Biosafety Now. I'm joined tonight by another co-founder of Biosafety Now, Justin Kinney, who is a professor of quantitative biology at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. We are a new US-based nonprofit organization. We launched in February of this year. We're led by experts in biomedicine, mathematics, public health, public policy, law, social science, and public advocacy, and we're working for a future where scientific research on pathogens supports human life without threatening it, and public trust in science is restored. To learn more about our mission, you can visit our website at biosafetynow.org. In addition, I would like to encourage all of you to take a look at the pinned tweet on our Twitter account. It has our petition that we launched on June 2nd, which seeks to prohibit the dangerous gain-of-function research that may have likely caused the COVID-19 pandemic. We're up to 1,800 signatures so far. I just encourage you all to check it out. And if you agree with our position, please add your name and encourage your friends and family members to do so. So Justin and I are very honored tonight to welcome two special guests to our panel, Dr. Karolina Corin and Emily Kopp, both of whom work for US Right to Know. US Right to Know is a US-based nonprofit investigative public health research and journalism group working globally to expose corporate wrongdoing and government failures that threaten our health, environment, and food systems. Karolina is making her first appearance on a Biosafety Now Twitter space, and so she is a staff scientist at US Right to Know who just started there, I believe, in 2022. She earned her master's degree in mechanical engineering and PhD in biological engineering from MIT, and went on to do a postdoc at WITS, which is a university in Johannesburg, South Africa. And then for 5 years prior to joining US Right to Know, she worked as a staff scientist at UCLA. Her work since joining US Right to Know has been investigating the origins of COVID-19, and we are very excited to welcome her, as I said, to her first space. And in addition to Karolina, we also have with us Emily Kopp, who's joined us before, and we appreciate her anytime she comes on. She is an investigative reporter at US Right to Know, specializing in health policy. She uses primary source records to obtain information related to the origin of COVID. And before that, she led coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. But prior to working at US Right to Know, she led coverage for the COVID-19 pandemic for Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call. Roll Call being a storied newspaper that focuses on issues related to what goes on at Capitol Hill. She broke many critical stories, including that the CDC was asking nurses to wear bandanas, the meltdown of Emergent Biosolutions, and corporations lobbying to shield themselves from liability from COVID deaths. And prior to that, she conducted investigations with Kaiser Health News, a nonprofit newsroom. So welcome to both of you. I know Justin wants to talk about, before we go any further with the articles that you guys have written recently, Justin has some questions about the lack of disclosure by the administration that he wanted to go over.
Yeah, so as you know, Congress passed a law that the U.S. had to declassify the intelligence it had on COVID origins, including very specific intelligence related to the individuals first believed to be infected, or the individuals at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who were infected early on, and they were supposed to release that intelligence yesterday, and they didn't. And so I was kind of Yeah, so basically, I just want your take on that. Like, is this surprising to you, considering that this is like a law that was passed?
I can jump in. I'll say, just as a caveat, I don't have a lot of experience doing reporting about the intelligence community. I mean, I'm a health policy reporter. So, so this is a little bit new to me. I don't think it's super surprising that the intelligence community feels that it's outside of the law. I think it has a long history of doing things outside of the law. But, you know, there's this interesting coinciding with Secretary Blinken's visit, and I think it's obvious just from reading public reporting about that visit that there was an effort to cool relations with Beijing and an effort to not wrinkle Beijing. And I think no matter what this intelligence says, it's going to look bad for Beijing. Whether the origin of this virus is a lab and that virus emerged in the fall of 2019, or if it's a zoonotic virus that emerged in December 2019, it's at the very least clear that Beijing let the virus spread around the world in the first weeks of January. Um, and there are some very evocative firsthand accounts from frontline doctors saying that they weren't permitted to wear masks into the hospital because there was this effort to suppress um, the fact that this virus was beginning to spread around the world. Um, and so I guess I'm not particularly surprised. I don't know if this timing was just an unfortunate coincidence. I won't pretend to have any special insight into that. But I think we should also just consider all of the political forces against the US releasing a full accounting of what it knows about the origins of COVID, not only because of the enormous possible geopolitical ramifications, but also because of its shared complicity. Um, you know, if this was a lab origin, the US government was funding researchers at that lab, including researchers connected to the Academy of Military Medical Sciences. And so, so I don't think it's surprising. I mean, I think it's obviously outrageous. I definitely share everyone's frustration. It's been 3 years, and we deserve to know what our government knows about why we've lost so many of our loved ones and why our businesses have folded and why our kids have had to learn on Zoom. And so I share everyone's frustration, but I don't think it's particularly surprising. But I don't know, Carolina, what do you think?
I think you summed everything up pretty well. I don't think it's surprising, outrageous and disappointing, but not surprising. And I guess the optimist in me is hoping that it's only because it's a holiday weekend and they'll release everything tomorrow. But I'm not holding out much hope for that.
I did want to ask a question, and I don't, I guess I didn't. I asked Carolina this earlier today, but Emily, this will perhaps be a bit of a. I don't mean this to be like a provocative question, but it relates to this interaction between Blinken. Blinken's visiting China and trying to do a diplomatic mission or whatnot, right? And of course, the U.S. is controlling what they release with regard to the FOIA requests. And so this is more of like a general question for you, because I guess you've been dealing with FOIA requests more than Carolina has. Do you ever get the sense that you're actually, the FOIA requests or the amount that they redact, the amount that they, choose to show you or don't choose to show you, is done strategically? And particular with this most recent article that you've written, did you consider that there were a lot of redactions, but the things that they didn't redact, is that a possible, sign from the US government, like a signal that they're using you to sort of signal towards China something about, what they have on them or whatnot? Or is that something that you've ever I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but that sort of came up in a discussion in one of the group chats I was in, and I thought that was a sad but potentially true statement in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I can help clear this up. Maybe at the expense of some personal embarrassment, which is just to say that we've had those cables, those redacted cables for a while, but I was prioritizing other stories simply because I wanted to gather more reporting, and just had made a calculation about essentially all of those redactions and what can we say and what can't we say. But seeing, the Times in the UK, and the report on Substack, sort of corroborating a lot of what those cables said. And of course, there have been other reports that have said much the same. My preference would have been to, talk to more experts and really flesh that story out. But because things were moving so quickly, I published, documents that we've had for a while, and deprioritized other stuff. So I don't think I'm never going to tell someone to not speculate about government officials conspiring to make themselves look better. But I think in this case, it's more of just a matter of my choice to prioritize it, because things were moving very quickly, rather than anything nefarious going on at the FOIA office at the State Department. But I don't think it's, unfair to speculate about at all. I'll never tell anyone that, but it wasn't as the timing wasn't as suspicious as maybe some people think. It was just I saw other stories moving and I decided to go ahead and move with that one. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. I guess it does lead to the follow-up of whether you felt that previously anything like that did happen, where releases to you guys were timed to coincide with events that were happening. I don't know if you ever felt like you were being used by the government to try to message to other countries or whatnot.
To be honest, again, I don't think it's unfair to speculate about that, but our documents are so hard won, especially in this investigation. I mean, it takes years. I mean, my boss tweeted today that we're suing over 2 emails that involve Anthony Fauci talking about the origins of COVID in early 2020. So it takes a long time. So I think the de facto position is redact everything and make it as difficult as possible to obtain any documents. And that's kind of where the strategizing ends. It's just obstruction, pure obstruction. I don't think there's like 4D chess happening. It's just try to avoid giving them as much information as possible and legal.
That's very useful to know. That's actually quite interesting because on the surface it did potentially appear that in this case there was something a little bit aloof, with the State Department giving you that stuff.
Yeah.
But it turned, that's really interesting.
I regret giving that impression. It was literally just, I've got to move on this because other people have got their stories out. And so I deprioritized something else I had been working on, and got this out ASAP. Also with the hope that, part of the reason I hadn't moved on it right away is because there are so many redactions and because there's so much unknown basically for folks who haven't read the story, we got 3 State Department cables and they had the headings, but they didn't have any of the evidence undergirding those headings. And so my preference would have been to help flesh that out with public sources, but I just had to move because the story was moving. I was going to be irrelevant, or these cables were going to be irrelevant pretty quickly. So anyway, that's the backstory there.
Okay, sorry. I guess it got a little ahead of ourselves because we didn't actually go into the sort of, the substance of the actual 2 articles that we were going to talk about. So could we maybe, Justin, do you want to
Yeah.
ask about the okay.
Yeah, so I'd first like to ask you guys about the article that you wrote jointly, that reporting that the U.S. government, specifically USAID, funded the discovery of close relatives of SARS-CoV-2, the closest known relative to SARS-CoV-2 known before the pandemic start. Can you just tell us about this story?
I'm going to rewind a little bit on this. So our article definitely shows that U.S. funding was involved in the discovery of RATG13, and also specifically NIH funding. Where USAID comes in is a little bit more murky. And so going back to NIH, the article that published the original partial sequence of RATG13 credits Dajic's understanding the risk of like emerging bat coronavirus grant as a funding source. And the grant itself, in two places, acknowledges that paper as an accomplishment that was funded by the grant. So it seems very clear that NIH funding was involved. Now, once you get to USAID funding, what we have is a letter to Senator Feinstein where that is claiming RATG 13 as an accomplishment, but their level of involvement is not so clear. What they actually state in the letter is that they sampled a lot of animals in China, and using predict protocols, they were able to find 52 SARS-like coronaviruses, including RATG 13. And so if you go through all of Predict's PCR data sets and final reports, what you'll find is that there are, I believe, around 42 coronaviruses total listed. Of those, I believe about 4 are SARS-like, 2 of which were obtained using USAID funding, but none of those appear to be novel according to their naming scheme. So according to their naming scheme, there are 15 novel ones, 12 alpha coronaviruses, 2 beta ones that are not related to SARS or MERS, and 1 that is MERS related but not SARS related. And so, there's a question of RATG13 is not listed there. There aren't 50 SARS-like coronaviruses listed. So where is this data coming from? And it seems as though those 50 viruses come from Dajic's NIH grant. And so, and again, the way that the letter is worded, it suggests that those viruses were found from the animals that were sampled, and yet they're only saying that the protocols rather than predict found them. And so, in my mind as a researcher, I'm wondering, did they actually find those viruses using the predict grant, which is possible? Or is their involvement more secondhand? Did they, use the protocols that they developed to find them, and are now using that discovery to try to bolster the successes of their program in order to get more funding?
Actually sounds quite complicated. And I
It
think
is.
one of the things that we were talking about earlier today is that given that you have a background in, biomedical research, and as a scientist you understand some of the nuances of the, reading between the lines on some of these documents that others may not, quite get, as it relates to, why certain things appear in progress reports, why certain things appears in grants. One of the most famous things is the claim that the research that was proposed in the diffuse proposal, to claim that because it wasn't funded that it wasn't performed is ludicrous if you've ever, worked in a lab. So I'm wondering, so is the implication here that there is an attempt to conceal the viruses that were obtained that were related to, RATG13, but also use them to get funding? So that's what's confusing to me. Is there, on the one hand, an attempt to conceal, and then on the other hand, an attempt to promote this predict program and laud its success?
That's a very difficult question to answer. And I think also you have to break apart different players in this scenario. So one thing that you have to keep in mind is that EcoHealth Alliance is the focal point between the WIV and various US funders. So the way that PREDICT worked is that each of the consortium partners was in charge of certain countries, and EcoHealth Alliance was that interface between PREDICT at USAID and China. And EcoHealth Alliance was also receiving funds from the NIH to do substantially the same type of work. So everything that PREDICT is getting is being filtered, through China and through EcoHealth, I would imagine. When it comes to, I guess, the head of PREDICT or the director or UC Davis, I don't believe that there is an intent to conceal. If you go back and look through our documents and you look at their communications around the beginning of the pandemic, they talk about looking through their data sets to see if they can find something that might help with COVID origins, if I recall correctly. And I don't think you would be seeing those types of emails if they were intentionally trying to conceal something. Now, when it comes to what EcoHealth Alliance knew or didn't know, or what the WIV knew or didn't know or reveal, that's a lot harder to say, at least based upon the public documents that we have so far. It's clear that this virus was sequenced and I think worked on before its sequence was released in 2020. And it is clear, I believe, that NIH and EcoHealth Alliance were somehow involved in this discovery, but exactly what they did is really difficult to parse out based on the information that is there.
It might be of use. Could I guess one of you go over the sort of history of RATG13? It's quite just the provenance as well, and the controversy around the change in nomenclature.
So I'll give hopefully
Yeah.
a very, very brief summary. So this is a virus that was found in a mine shaft that sickened 6 miners with SARS-like symptoms, and 3 of them died. So when the sequence was first published in early 2020, no USAID funding was credited, and it appeared as though this was the first time that they sequenced this virus. And only later it became clear that this virus was actually partially sequenced and uploaded in 2016, I believe, under a different name, and that the full sequence was obtained in 2018. So, that I think that led to a lot of speculation about the types of work that were being done at the WIV and the viruses that they may or may not be working with that perhaps haven't been reported.
So, Carolina, I'd like to follow up on that. So, one thing that has really been bugging me is the inconsistency in statements, in particular by Peter Daszak, about their involvement in the discovery of RATG13 and these other viruses sampled from the Mojang mine. But then also, one of the key claims among zoonosis proponents, especially the virologists themselves, like on This Week in Virology, arguing that SARS-CoV-2 could not have a research origin, is that, well, they wouldn't have, that the Xi Zhengli's lab didn't have other viruses to work on. And RATG13, although it's very close to SARS-CoV-2, is distant enough that it could not have been the direct progenitor. But there is a lot of reporting, in particularly in these documents. There's a lot of Xi Zhengli's lab likely has a lot of unpublished SARS-like CoV-2 viruses, but Peter Daszak seems to be saying that they didn't, or it's been difficult for me to follow that whole argument, but there seems to be real inconsistencies. So I was wondering if you could clarify what our state of knowledge is about, did Xi Jinping's lab have a bunch of unpublished coronaviruses that could potentially have been progenitors for SARS-CoV-2?
So I do believe that it's definitely possible that they had SARS-like coronaviruses that have not been disclosed to the public for any number of reasons, really. One of the projects that I've been working on kind of in the background is going through grant reports and progress reports and trying to track down every single coronavirus that's in there to see if it has been publicly reported. It's a work in progress, but there still are a few that I haven't there's several that I haven't been able to find. That alone suggests that there are viruses that have been discovered and that haven't necessarily been reported. I think there's a lot of evidence actually for this. For instance, there were those viruses, the spike sequences that appeared over the summer and that quickly disappeared in GenBank.
Yeah, could you elaborate on that?
I don't have too much to say about that other than there were a lot of coronavirus spike sequences that were released in GenBank and then were again removed from public view I think about 10 days later. So, and there could be legitimate reasons for that, but having said that, that just goes to show that there is information out there that is not necessarily available to the public.
I'd also like to talk about the article that Emily wrote about the State Department cables.
Well, we learned that the State Department, or folks at the State Department, and specifically analysts in Taiwan, were looking at the way in which Beijing censored the early pandemic. And the conclusion of this cable, we don't have the underlying evidence, but the conclusion was that authorities in Beijing, rather than sort of local officials, were the ones who were censoring early case information. That is intriguing. We also learned from another cable that the State Department analysts were looking at Wuhan not as a center of bushmeat trade, but rather the center of this burgeoning interest in dual-use biotechnology in China. Wuhan, I think, was almost mischaracterized early in the pandemic because there were a lot of images of the Huanan seafood market on CNN, and people thought of it as maybe less of a modern city than it truly is, but it has 11 million people, more than New York City, and is sometimes referred to as China's Chicago. And so the focus on that cable was that Wuhan makes sense as the epicenter of a pandemic, not because it is this hub of trade in animals that carry coronaviruses, but because it is a hub for coronavirus research. And I mean, that's obvious from publicly available sources, but it would be intriguing to see what further information perhaps the State Department has on that. And then another cable was about the ties between the People's Liberation Army and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And obviously, everyone's eager to see that information. And public sources have shown that there were indeed ties between the WIV and the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, which has led to some speculation about the biodefense work that the WIV was working on. Could it have even perhaps been bioweapons that they were working on? But one thing is obvious, which is that Xi Jinping does not have a good track record as far as being open and transparent and honest, because she has publicly stated that there was no military research at her lab. She said something like, there's been rumors that we had this special project, blah, blah, but it's not true. So, I'm eager to see what other evidence exists, but I think at this point it's pretty well established that there was a relationship between the military and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so I think that undermines her credibility, and it calls into question the credibility of scientists like Peter Daszak, who have spent years at this point assuring the public that there is no way the WIV could have been working on a virus that we're not already aware of, that's not already published, because there was classified research going on at the lab, and it's not obvious that we have access to all of their research, and that should have been obvious from the beginning. The few who have been calling for an investigation into the WIV from the beginning knew that that was nonsense from the beginning, and we've lost critical time sort of giving any credence to that argument that we absolutely know every genome of every virus they were working on. So that to me is the most critical piece. I mean, we can talk more about whether it was biodefense work or civilian work or bioweapons, but bottom line, we don't have full transparency into what was going on at the WIV, and that's very concerning.
I was wondering also if you could expand a bit on the role of UC Davis in the funding of it was UC Davis, right, in the funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So I need to look at the documents again, but I believe that it went to the WIV through EcoHealth.
Okay. But there have been a number of U.S. federal grants, right, on which UC Davis has also partnered as part of this collaboration. Is that right?
Yeah, UC Davis is a PREDICT partner. So that's some of the way that we've gotten insight into the PREDICT program is via California Public Records.
And could you actually review at a higher level, like what was this PREDICT program?
It was a virus hunting program that was looking to discover novel viruses that could be, I guess, studied in order to learn which ones could pose a threat in terms of pandemics. And so it was they worked in, I believe, around 30 countries, and there were several partners, but three main ones, which included UC Davis, EcoHealth, and Metabiota.
You know, there has been a lot of questioning about the utility of going out and just hunting viruses for advancing public health. But of course, going out and hunting novel viruses has clear potential applications for bioweapons development. So it's not surprising to me that the People's Liberation Army would be involved in studies on these viruses and working with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This might be going a bit far afield from the articles, but do you have any sense for the extent to which U.S. academic labs partner with the military on studies that have dual use, supposedly to identify, better characterize, to hunt viruses, better identify how they work and how they might go pandemic, but also research that has clear potential applications to developing new bioweapons?
I read in a separate State Department cable that as early as January 2020 on Weibo, there were rumors about the virus having come from Fort Detrick. So who was spreading those rumors, I think you can begin to guess. But the obfuscation of the possibility of a lab origin of COVID by pointing the finger at US biodefense was something that people were talking about kind of right away, it seems like. I mean, you can imagine what my Chinese counterpart would be writing if this pandemic had emerged out of Frederick, Maryland. They'd be talking about, the fact that there was a huge accident at USAMRIID and the fact that the leadership of that lab covered it up from the public. It wouldn't be hard for a Chinese journalist to point to safety issues at USAMRIID and say, well, clearly this is a problem.
I did, this question that Justin's question came up recently, and I had an email correspondence with Richard to ask him. The specific question was, how many labs in the U.S. would be doing, enhanced potential pandemic pathogens research? That the question in particular was about how much of those labs would be banned from doing research if the petition drive that we have was successful. That is, how many actual labs are doing this type of research. So he estimated that there's about 30 labs performing EPPP research, 10 of which are performing them on pathogens other than SARS-CoV-2, and then 20 performing them on SARS-CoV-2. Now, what was happening back in 2020, I don't know. And Richard doesn't have a phone, otherwise we could ask him to comment on that. What I did want to go back to with respect to the whole framing of this as bioweapons development by the Chinese, and that's really one of the things that was highlighted, I guess, in that Sunday Times article. They really pushed this narrative of it being a bioweapon being developed by the Chinese. But I think it's a bit misleading. We've been claiming, US scientists have been claiming that you need to make novel pathogens to see what might emerge in the future so that you can then develop a vaccine to treat it. And they've been calling this public health research. It's no different than what's been claimed as occurring in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The claim is that they were making unnatural pathogens and simultaneously developing vaccines to treat those. So I guess one of the concerns that I have is the use of this differential framing to sort of rally public support against China, or because it doesn't seem like there is any difference between what they were doing and what we're doing. But when we do it, we're claiming it's to prevent the next pandemic. I guess I don't know if that's something that either of you had, any of you had an issue with as well, or if that's just something that I know other people I've talked about this issue with raised the same concerns, that the narrative, when you want to talk about it as a bioweapon to get people opposed to it, you do it that way. But if you want people to support it, you say, oh, it's pandemic prevention.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about motive, right? So were you making dangerous viruses more dangerous because you had civilian interests in infectious diseases research, or were you doing it to build a bioweapon? I mean, I think SARS-CoV-2 would be not an ideal bioweapon, but the impact if the virus escapes is the same. So I think maybe this is simplistic, but I think as someone who is mostly interested in this topic, not because of politics, but because it led to millions of deaths, biodefense, bioweapons, it made a virus, if the pandemic is research related, it's related to making a virus more pathogenic in the lab. And that's something we need to look more closely at. And whether or not, was US involvement related to intelligence gathering and knowing what was going on in China's labs and what viruses it was working on, or was it purely civilian interest in preventing the next pandemic? At the end of the day, the US government directed money to virologists it couldn't oversee, that it had very little insight into, and that perhaps had connections to the Chinese military. Whether that was an intelligence gathering operation gone wrong or whether it was purely civilian, we're still dealing with the ramifications, possibly, if this virus wasn't zoonosis, or zoonotic. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think about it, but I think at the end of the day, if we're interested in this subject because we want clarity and accountability, I think making sure it never happens again is the most important. Kind of the motive and intent is less important to me.
Oh, I agree with you. I guess what I meant was the use of the media to frame the construction of these viruses as bioweapons when China's doing it, but as pandemic prevention when the US is doing it. That's what I object to. And I agree with you that this is just pure insanity. It's unethical. It should never have occurred. It should never occur again. But the concern I have is that we're now framing this as bioweapons manufacturing in China, while at the same time arguing in the US that we need to fund this research more and do more of this research. So, as a matter of public health, that's the issue that I have. And I guess this does relate into this connection with USAID that we've been talking about.
Well, and also something I think about a lot is I think historians should look at who sort of lit the fire that started the proliferation of maximum security labs and gain of function research. I mean, maybe Dr. Ebright has thoughts. I have suspicions, but I
He
feel
can't
like it
join us.
probably,
He doesn't have a phone.
yeah.
Like otherwise,
I'm sure if it didn't start with the Pentagon helped, and NIAID helped fuel the proliferation of maximum security labs. So I am totally on the same page as far as the shared culpability going back years.
Yeah, it seems very hypocritical to me for us to criticize like involvement of the Chinese military in the Wuhan Institute of Virology's research and other research when US biodefense is literally run out of the same agency as academic research on viruses, NIAID. The US biodefense industry is very tightly intermingled with academic research, and it seems in a very similar way.
I was also just going to chime in. Our story about RITG 13 is, related to reports citing anonymous sources that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology working on viruses, including RITG 13 and related viruses, were among the first infected with COVID. So that would put US research right at the center of the pandemic. So,
yeah, I actually really want to get your guys' take on those articles in The Intercept and on the Substack about, both the one is the report, of course, that of the specific names of the people at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who supposedly got sick, and the report claims that they're right actually patient zero for COVID, which would essentially prove that COVID came out of this risky coronavirus research. But then there's also the reporting from The Intercept that research was being pursued on viruses very similar to unpublished viruses, very similar to RETG13 in kind of secret, along with people at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but in collaboration with the People's Liberation Army.
there were things in the Times story that have been public for years at this point. Some of the experimentation on WIV1, for example, the fact that it generated a chimeric virus that had 10,000 times the viral load as the unmanipulated virus, that has been out there for a long time. But I can tell you, I think I was the only reporter to write about it. I mean, I might be literally the only person who wrote about it at the time that grant report came out. So I thought the stories were, written in a really nice way and called attention to things that have been public already, but it sort of put a mainstream stamp on it and called it to millions more people's attention. I mean, there's so much evidence that is in the public domain at this point from grant reports and grant proposals, of course, that just millions of people aren't aware of because science and health reporters have neglected to report on them. So as far as the evidence that those of us paying really close attention were already aware of, I think they did a good job describing it for a lay audience and just calling more attention to the fact that a lab origin was always a possibility based on just what we could read from public reports. As far as the stuff that isn't in the public domain, like the idea that the WIV had a virus more similar to COVID, the fact that they did indeed pursue the project and the diffuse proposal, the fact that they identified the 3 WIV researchers. I don't find any of those claims outlandish. They're not hard to believe, but for me, I would like to know how they know before putting too much stock in them. I guess I'm just more comfortable dealing with the FOIA docs and working from what we can see from primary source records, but it certainly raises a lot of interesting questions, and I hope that the declassification sheds more light on that.
Gregor, I'll get to you in a second. Dopaminergic.
Well, I've got two observations on this. Is that we're not talking just a binary thing of for Dietrich and Huan. I speak because I live in Asia and I live in Singapore, and so we have one of these lab here. You look at the scale of these labs; they exist in very many locations. Number one. Number two, they're very interconnected to military, or at least defense domain, because at least for the case of Asia, you know that the location of these labs are actually very proximal to other, just like the WIV, to other sort of military or at least defense sort of environment. So this is one thing. The second thing is when you look at complex system, you look at the energy. So first is the scale. So the scale is huge because these labs exist in many, many countries in the world. Second is the energy behind. So the energy would be the funding. So the funding is colossal. I mean, if you're talking about scale, compared to things like technology or anything like this, you're just looking at the level of funding of this grant. It's just stupefying, really. And then it implies effectively for me that the language that they've been using, to go back to the question that you had at the beginning about the semantic, of saying, is it public health? Is it really about a bioweapon, or is it, public health interest? Well, once you murk the semantic, which they have, like even the title of the grant, predict what? I mean, predict something implies that you are basically using language. You're murking the language so people get confused with what is it you're doing. And that is plausible deniability at all times. This is not a new technique from the military or from defense or even from people who are trying to gaslight you. So I think the fact that they're using things that can be both interpreted in either side of the equation, depending on what you need, is something that should be a red flag for all of us. And the fact that it affords them deniability, as we've seen Fauci do this, so we've seen now in the debacle of, OTES, the murking of language is something that is so powerful as a tool, because in case of a crisis, not only do you have deniability, but also you're going to have confusion of people trying to understand what is it they're looking at. And I think the moment we've got these three things, we've got the scale of the complex system, we've got the energy within the complex system, and then we have the intent of murking knowledge distribution and the sort of, intact concept of what the knowledge is. So in other words, I'm really talking truthful to you versus I'm trying to gaslight you. I'm trying to go around some sort of checks and balances that have been in place. Well, we've got three of these things as far as I'm concerned there. And therefore, for me, it's not even plausible that the intent is public health. My view would be that, yeah, maybe if we can get something out there that could also be good for public health, yeah, maybe. But essentially, this is a bioweapon entity for the globe. And as far as I'm concerned, I read this as we're already in a biowarfare. And it probably started not now. It started some time back.
So do you, well, your point is well taken. Do you have a question though? If you want to ask Emily or Caroline.
Well, what do they think about this concept of using semantic as journalists as a weapon that can be both, intentional and misleading for people to try to make sense, like for this article that we're talking about in the Times, right, or whatever they write. So
I totally agree. I mean, I have been in reporting on DC long enough to know that semantics are used all the time to obfuscate and obscure responsibility. I do feel like we have to be really careful when dealing with the topic of bioweapons, because there are enormous political ramifications for that kind of charge. And the practical effect of a virus escaping from a biodefense program versus a bioweapons program might be pretty slim, but the political difference is great. And so my perspective, just as a layperson who has just been observing this space for a while, is that I think we need to revisit how we respond as a global community to lab accidents, and to even suspected, bioweapons gone wrong, so that we can deal with emerging technology and synthetic biology in a responsible way that, doesn't lead to any more deaths than we've already experienced. So I hope that makes sense. But I totally agree. I think the way in that, I think the way that Fauci and a lot of virologists who are opposed to considering the lab leak theory talk about this stuff appears almost designed to obscure the dangers of what they're doing. And I think we need to be plain spoken and call for better regulation.
Carolina, did you have anything on that?
I pretty much agree with everything that Emily said. We definitely need to have speak plainly, say what you're doing, and have a much better and transparent way of dealing with issues when they actually, if and when they do crop up.
Yeah, and I do agree with this whole issue of being careful about the term bioweapon, although it is really important to me to understand, like to very plainly communicate to the public that the things that are being created are by definition bioweapon agents. This is not something we should be screwing around with, and the value to public health is limited if existent at all. So, all right,
Well,
Gregor, real
yeah,
quick,
yeah.
I got questions. Go ahead. Let's do some rapid fire questions.
Thank you. It's good to be back. So I heard some talk about RATG 13, but I was wondering what about Banar 52? That's actually closer, genetically more closer to SARS 2 than RATG 13. Articles were written about that. So there's one by Sherlock Gnomes, who was run off Twitter. There's one by Eliosov. There's one by Brutal, Washburn, and Van Dongen. They all talk about Banar 52. For instance, the last three authors write, Banar 52 is the closer relative to SARS-CoV-2 by over 200 nucleotides. And that applies especially to the spike.
Okay, so hold on, Gregor. So Emily or Carolina, you have any comment on Banal 52, one of my favorite pop bands of all time?
Yeah, so basically it is, if you look at just a sequence comparison, it is closer genetically. But if you look at the phylogenetic analyses, and this also includes the paper that originally published Banal 52, they still place RATG13 as a closer relative to COVID, mainly because of, I believe, because of the backbone.
Okay. Scarlett, you have a question?
Oh, yeah. So, hello, everyone. A friend of mine who lives in the United States, he went to this American Society for Microbiology conference, which was held in Houston, I think last week or so. And apparently there was some kind of an event featuring Dr. Eddie Holmes and This Week in Virology podcast host. I forgot his name. And all he heard was the same. I mean, nobody even asked them any question about COVID origins. Okay, so
right. Hold on. What's the question though? Because we all are not big fans of This Week in Virology, and they do the same stuff.
Yeah, so my question is, why are they still hammering on trying to completely nullify the lab leak hypothesis, knowing fully well that the evidence is mounting against their theory of natural origins?
We can only speculate, but it seems like one, it's just naturally difficult for people to admit they're wrong. Two, there is, of course, the financial incentive to keep pushing the idea that there's no way in possible that virology could cause a massive scale pandemic. And then with respect to This Week in Virology, I believe Racchianello, and I've posted this on Twitter before, he made a very major contribution. His career contribution to virology was, in fact, the technology that is used to make the genetic modifications in these synthetic viruses. That's perhaps an oversimplification, but look at his career-defining scientific achievement. I think for him it would be particularly painful if that ultimately then led to a pandemic. So that's the
and it's the technology to, now with high throughput sequencing, it's the technology that allows you to sequence a virus and then reconstruct it without ever having isolated it.
I want to get through some more. I want to let Emily and Carolina go in a few minutes. So, Adriano, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Question to Carolyn. So you have an FOI. A while back, you talked about an FOI for the NCBI for queries on the amino acid and nucleotide sequence of the furin cleavage site, with the idea being, I suppose, that hits from researchers from China early in the pandemic or during the creation of the virus would have searched the nucleotide or amino acid sequence for the unique SARS-CoV-2 furin cleavage site in NCBI. Can you comment on where that FOI is, how that's proceeding?
So when I did this FOIA, so it's a little bit of a shot in the dark in the sense that we don't know if you can FOIA queries. We don't know if that information is kept, and if so, for how long. But if that information is kept, then that could definitely show us whether or not somebody was looking for something that's like SARS-CoV-2, and hence whether or not they had something like SARS-CoV-2. So they've responded. We're still going. It's in progress, I think, is the best way to answer that question.
Did you also punt that question to the congressional committees who might have more subpoena powers for the public agencies like the NCBI?
So I haven't personally. I will ask our supervisor, our boss, to see if he has.
Knuckle, are you ready? Looks like you have your hand up. Okay, go ahead.
I sure am. Thank you, and thank you guys again for your continued support on this important matter. We seem to be going in these fits and starts of media, whether it goes from raccoon dogs or whether it goes from Department of Energy or other three-letter agencies opining on the origins theory. But Jeffrey Sachs kind of came out a few months ago with this kind of coming to Damascus moment on how bad and how captured his Lancet investigation was. Do you see him or an equivalent hosting a similar independent audit that's outside of government kind of three-letter agencies, to truly look at the origins discussion, or has that ship sailed?
There is essentially no momentum for a 9/11 commission style investigation into the origin of COVID or the response, because it doesn't benefit either party politically. And that's just how craven Washington is if it doesn't benefit either party, then they just won't move forward. I don't know. I mean, I think that would be great if an independent body wanted to take up the question, but it would have to be the right organization, I think, with real credibility and open-mindedness. And I think I can't think of any on this question, at least. But I'd love to see something like that.
Well, and even the Lancet itself might not be a trustworthy organization, but at least it was a start, and it was something that was funded and commissioned by the White House, and it was kind of the only real attempt to have a true independent audit outside of people like yourself or people that are kind of discussing this thing online, but it's simply not getting anywhere to the masses or to to anyone that I know or that I talk about in terms of just getting to the bottom of this, and maybe not to solve it from a SARS-CoV-2 standpoint, but what's the next pandemic that's going to be released from one of these labs? And I feel like we have learned nothing as a society or as a scientific professionals to be able to say that we know where this thing came from and we know how to prevent it.
I'd like to speak to that actually just for a second. So I think one thing that the U.S. government can do that independent commissions like the Lancet Commission cannot do is that the U.S. government has access to various intelligence information, and as a scientist, seeing the publicly available scientific evidence on the origins of COVID, it just seems unlikely that any scientific evidence is going to definitively solve where SARS-CoV-2 came from. A lot of the arguments from the virologists are that, well, it can, and science can, and in fact has solved where it came from. It came from the Hunan wet market, the Hunan seafood market. But one thing one question I have for you, Emily and Carolina, is, the U.S. intelligence agencies, they have access to a variety of intelligence sources, foreign intelligence sources. But I also wonder, do you have an understanding of whether, the main intelligence agencies have access to the relevant domestic information if it's held by other government agencies? When each individual government agency came out with its own intelligence assessment, it was not clear to me that they were sharing information. In particular, it wasn't clear to me whether the FBI had access to the Diffuse grant which was with the Department of Defense, or if the CIA has access to NIH proposals that the investigators at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or perhaps through EcoHealth Alliance, had put in. So do you have any sense for how much information is shared across government agencies in order to come to these intelligence assessments?
I was also just going to contribute related to Jeffrey Sachs that he had a webinar related to the Lancet Commission after, he had made it clear that he thought a lab origin was more likely, or at least deserving of investigation. And he told us that he had invited, I don't remember the exact number, but a lot of virologists who favor a zoonotic wet market origin, and all of them declined to participate. I think that's interesting. But anyway, I can't say I have great insight into how the intelligence community has been doing its investigation. My impression is the same as yours, that they seem very siloed, and that there is some evidence that the FBI had access to EcoHealth Alliance's grants when the HHS OIG was looking into EcoHealth. But beyond that, I don't know that I have much to offer. I mean, we have submitted FOIAs related to this, and people can experience 5 to 10 year delays when it comes to some of these agencies. Their information is very closely held, and I've been looking through our redacted State Department documents, and some of them aren't formally eligible for declassification for 2 decades. So we're trying to get information out. We're trying to learn more. We're not the New York Times, so we rely on public records, and that can take some time. So I'm afraid I don't have good answers.
Phony Tauchi.
I was just wondering how much you all see the U.S. investments in WIV as very emblematic of the broader U.S. war on terror, in which the U.S. funds some kind of groups abroad, thinking that they're allied with them because their interests are allied with them because, let's say, they are against the Russians at the time, or the Soviet Union, for example, like the U.S. did with the Mujahideen, which later turned out to be Al Qaeda. But I was curious, how much of this is a parallel in terms of in the sphere of biology. The U.S. invests in groups that thinking, oh well, we have some shared interests, or this is gonna let us better control this group in future, etc. But then it turns to bite them back.
I can't say I know much, but I think you're asking important questions, and I hope we can sort it out in the years to come. I think, as I said earlier, whether the US government funneling money to scientists with ties to the PLA was related to intelligence gathering, or whether it was purely civilian, it might have had the effect of killing millions of people. So I think understanding the historical reasons are important, and I hope to know more one day. I think it's an important question, but I don't know.
Oh, Scarlett,
can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. So how come countries in Europe are not asking for, pushing the US government for investigation? Because countries like Italy have some of the worst, one of the most affected countries, right, from this pandemic. So why is there not a global push for an investigation? Thank you.
Australia experienced economic ramifications, retaliatory behavior from China. A COVID origins investigation would piss off, probably the two most powerful superpowers in the world. So, again, I'm a health policy reporter, so this is pure speculation, but that would be my guess.
Okay, well, it is a good time then to wrap up.
This was a great discussion. I feel like we didn't shy away from the uncomfortable, tough questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, agreed. And thank you very, very much.
I will say, I was going to just say, on these spaces, you can tell who's honest and who has integrity. And I think, both Emily and Karolina have that in spades. So I would encourage, find people you can trust, because it's not easy these days, frankly. And I would say that I appreciate, the work that US Right to Know is doing. And Emily and Karolina, you're always welcome on these spaces. Justin, do you have anything to say before I end it?
I just wanted to second that thought. Thank you so much, Emily and Karolina. It's so valuable to have your voice on these matters. And please continue the excellent work you're doing at US Right to Know.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
With that, I'll just remind everybody, hopefully we won't have technical issues, but tomorrow night we'll be back at 8 o'clock Eastern Time with Laura Kahn. So I hope we can have a technically uneventful evening. Thank you all for joining us. And I guess keep asking the tough questions. I got to come up with a better slogan at the end. But take care, everyone. Good night.